Nestled in the quiet corners of Maple Hollow, Ohio, a town where everyone knew everyone and secrets were shared over picket fences, lived Adeline Moore, a girl whose dreams smelled of cinnamon and homemade bread. She grew up in a modest two-bedroom house with her widowed father, Caleb Moore, and two elder brothers, Ryan and Ethan, who played football in the yard while Adeline baked cookies for their teammates. Her mother had died of ovarian cancer when Adeline was only 6, and since then, Caleb had poured every ounce of his strength into raising his children with discipline, love, and humility. Adeline was always different, quiet, observant, never one to compete for attention. Her solace came in the form of recipes scribbled in old notebooks, flour-dusted aprons, and the smell of rising dough at dawn. She would often say, "A kitchen is the only place where I don't feel too small to dream." Her dream? To one day own a culinary school where she could teach girls like her how to build from scraps. Despite being from a small town, Adeline was known for her incredible work ethic and unshakable kindness. During her teenage years, she worked weekends at Miss Lydia's bakery, saving up enough to attend a community college nearby where she studied hospitality and food science. While her peers partied, Adeline interned in the back kitchens of event halls, volunteering to do the jobs no one else wanted, scouring pots, icing 5-tier cakes, or hand-washing china. Her best friend, Emily, often teased her, saying, "You've got the patience of a nun and the ambition of a CEO." Yet despite her skill and passion, Adeline battled deeply rooted insecurities. She didn't wear makeup. She hated mirrors. And she never dared to think she was beautiful. Her idea of love was built from watching her father never remarry, never forget his wife, and always place family above his own needs. Men in Maple Hollow didn't chase girls like Adeline. She was the marriage type, not the exciting, glamorous kind men in suits lined up for. But she never complained. She stayed in her lane, working, saving, dreaming. Quietly. Adeline's life changed the summer she turned 26, during a trip to Chicago to cater a friend's engagement party. It was her first major booking outside Ohio, and she was terrified. Emily had practically forced her into taking the opportunity. The crowd was large, loud, and loaded, with luxury cars parked outside and guests wearing labels Adeline had only ever read about online. She was refilling the champagne tower when a man bumped into her by accident, nearly knocking over the tray of mini croissants she carried. That man, Brandon Callahan, apologized with a smirk, charming and unapologetically confident. "You don't belong behind the tray," he said casually. "You look like someone who should own the room, not serve it." Adeline blushed, assuming he was teasing. But he wasn't. That moment, so simple, so spontaneous, would become the first domino to fall in a chain of events that would build her up, break her down, and eventually lead her to a kind of strength no bakery, no kitchen, no dream had ever taught her. Brandon Callahan was a man bred by legacy, tailored by privilege, and haunted by pressure. Born into one of Boston's wealthiest families, he was the only son of Vivian Callahan, a cold, sharp-tongued heiress who managed the family's billion-dollar publishing empire with an iron grip. His father, Philip Callahan, died in a car accident when Brandon was just 11, leaving Vivian to mold him into the perfect successor. Brandon's childhood had been a cocktail of piano lessons, debate club, boarding schools, and business boot camps. He learned early that perfection wasn't a choice, it was the standard. As a teenager, he rebelled. He skipped cotillion balls, got into fistfights at Exeter, and once ran off to LA for a week with a girl he barely knew. That girl later sold the story to a tabloid. Vivian crushed it with a team of lawyers, but the message was clear: he was only tolerated when he stayed on script. Despite the family name and inherited wealth, Brandon never really fit into his mother's mold of aristocracy. After graduating from Yale with a degree in business, he shocked his family by turning down a position at Callahan Publishing and instead starting his own marketing firm, Nova Bridge, from scratch. At first, Vivian called it a pet project, assuming he'd fail and come crawling back. But Brandon, clever and dangerously charming, turned Nova Bridge into a 7-figure company within 3 years. He knew how to sell people an image, especially when that image was himself. Handsome, stylish, fluent in social currency, Brandon became a fixture in Boston's elite circles. Women swooned over him. Men envied him. Investors trusted him. And yet, inside, Brandon carried a hollow ache. No amount of money or recognition filled the void left by his father's absence or his mother's cold approval. Deep down, he longed for something that felt real, unscripted, imperfect, honest. Something like what he felt in the fleeting gaze of the woman who dropped mini croissants at the Chicago engagement party. He couldn't stop thinking about her. Adeline Moore. He asked the host, Jonathan Griggs, about her. She's just the caterer, Jonathan shrugged. But Brandon remembered her nervous smile, the way her eyes didn't dart around the room seeking attention, and how her hands trembled but didn't fumble under pressure. She was refreshing. Unlike the polished, high-gloss women he usually dated, Adeline radiated an unintentional elegance. He tracked her down through the catering company she freelanced with and sent flowers, something simple, daisies, her favorite. They began texting, slowly, cautiously. She was hesitant. He was persistent. Within a few weeks, he flew to Ohio under the guise of a business pitch, but really just to see her. Adeline's world was soft, humble, and warm. It became a retreat for him, a space where he could strip away the branded armor and just be Brandon. And for the first time in a long time, he felt seen. Not as the heir, the mogul, or the polished persona. Just as a man. A man falling for someone real. Their first real date wasn't extravagant or planned by a PR team. Brandon invited Adeline to a small lakeside cabin just outside Cincinnati that belonged to one of his college buddies who owed him a favor. Adeline arrived in jeans and a ponytail, her anxiety hidden behind a polite smile, while Brandon, dressed in chinos and a gray sweater, looked far more relaxed than he ever did in corporate meetings or city brunches. He grilled steaks badly, and she laughed softly, offering to take over the kitchen. They talked late into the night, huddled on the cabin porch beneath a patchy blanket, sipping hot chocolate as fireflies danced around them. She told him about losing her mother, how baking became her way of coping, and how her dream wasn't just to open a bakery, but to run a culinary school for girls from working-class families. Brandon listened intently, touched by her sincerity. It was the first time in years someone had spoken to him without an agenda. From that night, their bond grew in unlikely harmony, his chaos balancing her calm, her humility softening his arrogance. Adeline, always slow to trust, was initially skeptical of Brandon's interest. She couldn't wrap her mind around why a man like him, wealthy, educated, from an entirely different world, would choose her. But Brandon chased her with the patience of a man who had found peace after a lifetime of noise. He flew in to see her on weekends. He introduced her to quiet luxuries she'd never imagined, picnics with catered lunches, surprise bookstore visits where she could take anything she wanted, handwritten letters left in the covers of her cookbooks. And yet, he never made her feel less for not having the same pedigree. Adeline, in return, gave him honesty. She didn't flatter his ego. She pointed out his blind spots, challenged his temper, and made him try things like apple picking or bargain shopping at flea markets. For once, he wasn't living for appearance, he was simply living. Despite their different upbringings and social classes, Brandon and Adeline began to understand one another on a soul-deep level. She brought color to his grayscale life. He gave her a glimpse of possibilities beyond her small town. Still, their relationship raised eyebrows. Adeline's brother Ryan, fiercely protective, warned her to be careful. Brandon's mother, Vivian, fumed when she heard about the small-town girl stealing her son's attention. "She'll never fit into your world," she told him, cold and dismissive. But Brandon didn't care, not yet. He was enchanted. He promised Adeline that he would never let the world change what they had. At night, she'd curl up next to him and whisper, "This feels too good to be real." Brandon would respond by tracing her knuckles and saying, "Then let's make it our reality." What they didn't know was that love alone wouldn't be enough. That what felt like a fairy tale was already sowing the seeds of a storm no one saw coming. It was during Thanksgiving weekend that Brandon made the decision that startled even himself. He had flown Adeline out to Boston to meet his inner circle, something he had kept postponing for months. He told her it was a simple holiday gathering, but deep down, he knew it was his opportunity to defy expectations. The Callahan family estate was a sprawling colonial mansion adorned with chandeliers, polished marble floors, and portraits of ancestors no one remembered but everyone revered. Adeline wore a navy blue dress she'd bought from a thrift store and altered herself. She looked beautiful but visibly out of place among women dripping in designer labels and expensive perfumes. Brandon's mother, Vivian, looked her over once, nodded with icy indifference, and walked away. Still, Adeline smiled through it all, offering to help in the kitchen, chatting gently with the staff, and laughing shyly when Brandon introduced her to old friends who gave her pitiful smiles and whispered behind manicured hands. Dinner was a glittering affair, with 20 guests seated around an impossibly long table. The conversation was political, pretentious, and loud, until Brandon stood abruptly, glass in hand, heart pounding louder than the crystal chime. "I have something to say," he announced, ignoring Vivian's sharp glare. Adeline looked confused as all eyes turned to them. Brandon took a deep breath, walked over to her, and, right there in front of a stunned audience, got down on one knee. The room fell silent. "Adeline Moore, I may come from a world obsessed with image, but I've never felt more real than when I'm with you. Will you marry me?" Gasps fluttered across the room like moths hitting glass. Adeline was frozen, her throat dry, her eyes wide. For a long second, she said nothing, until she finally whispered yes. Brandon slipped a ring onto her finger. It wasn't his family heirloom, it was a simple sapphire he picked because it reminded him of the first dress she wore. The applause was hesitant, slow, confused. Vivian didn't clap at all. After the dinner, the night turned cold in more ways than one. Vivian confronted Brandon in the foyer, furious. "Have you lost your mind? Do you think this girl will ever understand the Callahan legacy?" He stared back with restrained defiance. "I'm not marrying a legacy, Mother. I'm marrying a woman." The news of their engagement spread quickly, some tabloids calling it the business tycoon's rebellion, others branding it Boston's most controversial proposal. Adeline didn't sleep that night. Her heart raced from both joy and fear. What had she gotten herself into? Meanwhile, Brandon held her close and promised, "It'll be us against the world." But neither of them realized that the world wasn't just outside their door, it was already seeping in through the cracks. Friends who once adored him grew silent. Old flames reemerged. The whispers got louder. And somewhere, deep in Vivian's study, a quiet war began, a mother determined to dismantle a love she believed could never belong. The wedding was quiet, intimate, and entirely unlike the Callahan tradition. Against Vivian's wishes, Brandon and Adeline chose a coastal ceremony in Cape Cod, attended by only a few trusted friends and close family. Adeline's brothers, Ryan and Ethan, stood protectively by her side, while Emily served as her maid of honor, glowing with pride. Brandon, defiant yet beaming, exchanged vows beneath an arch of wildflowers, barefoot on the beach, his gaze never leaving the woman who changed his entire perspective on love. For a moment, the world outside didn't matter. No press, no polished socialites, no judgmental stares, just sea breeze, promises, and hope. They danced under strings of fairy lights to no music, laughing like kids, whispering about the bakery Adeline wanted to open and Brandon's plans to expand Nova Bridge internationally. That night, in a candlelit cottage overlooking the water, they made love for the first time as husband and wife, unaware of how the very thing that brought them together would soon be the wedge driving them apart. After their honeymoon in Santorini, reality crept in like an unwelcome guest. Brandon returned to Boston to a wave of boardroom backlash. Investors expressed concern about his choice in spouse and how it might affect the firm's branding. Though he never said it aloud, the words gnawed him. Meanwhile, Adeline moved into the Callahan estate, a cold fortress lined with priceless antiques and invisible rules. Vivian greeted her with backhanded compliments and strict boundaries. "Don't touch the art, don't rearrange the kitchen, don't speak about personal things during dinner." Adeline, determined to earn respect, started taking online business courses, began scouting small retail spaces for her bakery, and stayed out of Vivian's way. But the silence grew louder between her and Brandon. He started missing dinner, coming home late, drowning in client meetings. Their moments together became rushed, mechanical. Adeline noticed that when she spoke about her dreams, Brandon smiled, but never asked questions. It wasn't hostility. It was something worse, detachment. Brandon's social circle, once warm during their courtship, began to freeze around her. At networking events, Adeline stood alone, a shadow in designer rooms, often introduced as Brandon's wife with no mention of her name or passions. She tried to blend, tried to shine, but the conversations always looped back to stocks, yachts, or scandalous gossip about whose marriage was crumbling next. Her bakery idea was often dismissed as cute or a hobby project. Still, she pressed on. She found a small space in South End and poured her savings into it, calling it Flower and Light. Brandon didn't show up for the opening. He sent flowers and a note, "Proud of you." Tied in meetings all day. Rain check? She cried that night, not because he wasn't there, but because he didn't even realize what his absence meant. She had married a man who once saw her, but now only looked through her, and she didn't know how to bring him back. Or if he even wanted to be brought back at all. Brandon's world was spinning faster than Adeline could ever hold on to. Nova Bridge had just signed 2 lucrative global clients, and the firm's headquarters relocated to a sleek high-rise downtown, a glass fortress that mirrored his lifestyle, pristine, exclusive, and detached. Brandon was always in meetings, on calls, or traveling to Paris or Dubai for corporate summits. When he was home, he was distant, physically present, emotionally absent. He didn't notice when Adeline stopped wearing makeup or when she stopped cooking his favorite late-night meals. He didn't notice when she stopped asking if he wanted to talk. He chalked it up to marriage settling into routine, to the demands of success. But to Adeline, it felt like erasure, like slowly dissolving into someone's background. When she brought up how they hadn't taken a vacation in months or that he hadn't stepped foot in Flower and Light since opening day, he kissed her forehead, muttered soon, and left again, leaving her surrounded by silence and self-doubt. It was during one of Brandon's absence-filled weekends that she met Chase Morgan, Brandon's best friend and Nova Bridge's co-founder, at a business brunch for spouses of entrepreneurs. Chase was tall, well-groomed, and arrogant in a way that made his confidence feel like a performance. He greeted Adeline with polite indifference, then later whispered to someone at the bar, "She's sweet, but never Brandon's type." Adeline overheard. She smiled through it, excused herself, and spent the rest of the event in the bathroom, staring at her reflection, wondering what type she was and why. Suddenly, she felt like an accessory in her own marriage. That night, Brandon returned home, drunk and unusually defensive. When she asked how the summit went, he snapped, "Why do you ask questions you don't understand the answers to?" Then, seeing her flinch, he sighed, "Sorry. I'm just tired." But he never explained further. The apology was surface level, like everything else between them lately. Adeline's heart grew heavier by the week. She began confiding in Emily, who reminded her she was worthy of more than being tolerated. "You didn't marry a man to be treated like wallpaper," she said fiercely. Adeline tried, once again, to bridge the growing distance. She suggested therapy, a getaway, even cooking together like they used to. Brandon laughed it off. "You're making a big deal out of nothing." But it wasn't nothing. It was everything. The nights were colder. The bed felt lonelier. And every time she looked at him, she saw less of the man who once promised to fight the world for her, and more of a stranger she was scared to confront. Still, she stayed. Hoping. Praying. Pouring herself into her bakery, into her late-night journaling, and into books about marriages and their slow undoing. She didn't know it then, but the end had already begun. And the worst part? It would come not with an explosion, but with a whisper. It began with a name Adeline had never heard but would soon never forget, Miranda Hale. The first time Brandon mentioned her, it was in passing. An old classmate. She's handling branding for Leclerc, he said, referring to a French luxury fashion house partnering with Nova Bridge. He didn't offer more, and Adeline, trying not to sound suspicious, didn't press. But days later, when a glossy business magazine arrived in the mail, Miranda was on the cover, statuesque, golden-haired, draped in designer silk with a headline that read, "The Return of Boston's Ice Queen." Adeline flipped the page and paused when she saw Brandon's name mentioned alongside hers. The article praised their natural chemistry, calling them a powerhouse duo revitalizing elite branding. That night at dinner, Adeline asked gently, "You and Miranda seem close." Brandon didn't look up from his phone. "She's just efficient. That's all." But there was something in the way he said it that made her stomach twist. Miranda's arrival disrupted more than just corporate synergy, it began to unravel the little bit of peace Adeline had left. She met Miranda a week later at one of Nova Bridge's cocktail events, unprepared for the sheer presence the woman carried. Miranda was everything Brandon's world worshipped, elegant, articulate, effortlessly poised. She greeted Adeline with a smile that was just tight enough to sting. "I've heard so much about you," she said, voice silk-lined and cool. "I was surprised Brandon married. He always said marriage wasn't for him." The words were surgical, designed to cut. Adeline smiled, biting back the tremble in her chest, and excused herself under the pretense of needing fresh air. Brandon didn't notice. He was too busy laughing at something Miranda said. That night, Adeline lay awake, the memory of Miranda's perfume clinging to her skin like a warning. She wanted to trust Brandon. She wanted to believe this was just business. But deep down, something primal whispered, "This is different." Over the following weeks, Miranda became a constant presence. She was at every company function, her name casually dropped in Brandon's conversations, her laugh echoing through speaker calls that carried late into the night. Adeline began to feel like a third wheel in her own marriage, present, but no longer vital. One afternoon, she stopped by Nova Bridge with lunch, only to find Brandon and Miranda in his office, seated too close, laughing over a private joke. When Adeline entered, they both stiffened. "Oh, hey babe," Brandon said awkwardly, standing too late. Miranda offered a smile with sharp eyes, then excused herself with the grace of a queen who already knew she was winning. Brandon looked flustered, grateful, even relieved when Adeline said nothing and left. But she felt it, that gnawing, hollow ache of being quietly replaced. And in that moment, Adeline realized something terrifying: not all betrayals are loud. Some sneak in with soft smiles and familiar faces, and you don't even notice you've been pushed out until the door locks behind you. The cracks in their marriage deepened like hairline fractures on glass, silent at first, but waiting for the slightest pressure to shatter everything. Adeline tried to stay steady. She busied herself at Flower and Light, where her cinnamon almond croissants were becoming local favorites, and even scheduled cooking classes for teenage girls on weekends. But every victory felt dimmed when she came home to cold leftovers and empty bedsheets. Brandon was home less and less, often claiming late meetings, late-night drinks with clients, or weekend conferences in other cities. He never offered details, and she stopped asking, afraid of the answers. But what hurt most wasn't the distance. It was the subtle change in how he saw her. He no longer complimented her food. He no longer kissed her forehead while rushing out. He no longer looked at her like she mattered. And when she asked if they could plan a date night, he blinked like the request was foreign. "I'll check my schedule," he said, already turning away. When Emily visited for the weekend, she noticed the change instantly. The light had gone out in Adeline's eyes. During a late-night wine session in the kitchen, Emily asked bluntly, "Are you okay?" Adeline hesitated, smiled weakly, and said, "He's just busy." But when Emily pressed harder, Adeline finally broke. She told her everything, about Miranda, the late nights, the icy silences. Emily didn't mince words. "He's emotionally cheating on you, Addie. Whether it's physical yet or not doesn't even matter. You're not crazy for noticing." Adeline's lips trembled as tears filled her eyes. "I don't know how we got here. I tried so hard." Emily pulled her into a tight hug, whispering, "You didn't fail." He stopped trying. The next morning, Adeline found herself watching old videos of their early days, her laugh, his smile, their promises. They felt like strangers now. Like footage from a life that had died without anyone holding a funeral. Desperate to confront what she feared, Adeline arranged a quiet dinner at home that evening, candles, wine, his favorite grilled steak with truffle potatoes. She wore the white dress he once said made her look like summer. When Brandon arrived, he barely noticed. He loosened his tie, muttered "smells great," and sat down, distracted. Halfway through the meal, Adeline asked softly, "Do you still love me?" He froze, fork midair. His answer was a sigh, long and heavy. "Why would you ask that?" She didn't reply. He looked at her like she was a question he didn't want to answer. "You're making things too complicated," he finally said, pushing his plate away. That night, he slept in the guest room, for the third time that month. Adeline lay alone in the master bedroom, staring at the ceiling, finally beginning to understand, you can't keep a marriage alive by yourself. Especially not one that's already given your seat to someone else. It was a rainy Thursday when Adeline heard the words that broke her, words not meant for her ears, yet spoken carelessly by the man who once swore she was his world. She had stopped by Nova Bridge unannounced, holding a basket of fresh pastries and a note tucked beneath the napkin that read, "Thought you could use something warm today." She smiled nervously at the receptionist, who waved her in without question. As she approached Brandon's office, she heard laughter, his voice, unmistakably relaxed, mingling with Miranda's. The door was slightly ajar, and Adeline paused when she heard Brandon say, "Adeline's sweet, but let's be honest, she's not exactly a brand-forward partner. She was never meant to be front-facing. More like a placeholder." Miranda chuckled, replying, "Well, at least she knows her lane." Adeline's legs buckled. The basket slipped from her hands, landing with a thud. She turned quickly, before they saw her, and walked away, rain soaking through her coat, grief pooling in her shoes. Back home, the silence was deafening. Adeline sat at the edge of the bed, staring at her reflection in the vanity mirror, wondering when she became invisible. Her fingers trembled as she took off her wedding ring and laid it gently in a velvet box, not out of spite, but out of mourning. She didn't cry. Not that night. She moved robotically, feeding herself a spoonful of rice she couldn't taste, showering in water that felt colder than it should. The betrayal wasn't in the flirtation with Miranda, it was in the dismissal, the insult, the reduction of her to a silent prop in the background of Brandon's image. That evening, she looked up therapists online and booked a session with Dr. Naomi Fields, a woman with kind eyes and a reputation for helping women rebuild from emotional neglect. It was the first act of defiance Adeline had committed in a long time. Not to hurt Brandon, but to find what she had lost. Herself. The next morning, she arrived at Dr. Naomi's office 10 minutes early, clutching a notebook and a pen as if they'd protect her. Naomi greeted her warmly, listened more than she spoke, and didn't flinch when Adeline finally said, "I think I've become someone I don't recognize." Over the weeks that followed, Adeline peeled back the layers she had buried, her fears, her unmet needs, her growing resentment. Naomi didn't offer pity. She offered perspective. "You are not crazy," she reminded her. "You're just waking up." Empowered by the sessions, Adeline began to quietly reclaim pieces of her soul. She added new items to Flower and Light's menu. She began journaling again. She took long walks in the morning and listened to podcasts about healing and identity. Slowly, she stopped waiting for Brandon to notice her absence. Because deep down, she understood now, sometimes the deepest pain isn't being left, it's realizing you were never really seen to begin with. The final confirmation came not through whispers or speculation, but through Adeline's own eyes, and it was worse than she'd imagined. It was Saturday night, and Brandon had once again claimed he'd be away on a client dinner. But when Emily called, her voice low and tense, everything stopped. "He's not where he says he is," she whispered. "I just saw him on the rooftop terrace at the Arlington Club. He's not alone. It's Miranda." For a moment, Adeline couldn't breathe. Her hands trembled as she changed into a coat and left the house in silence, like a ghost floating through her own life. The Arlington Club was one of Boston's most exclusive venues, private, high security, impossible to enter without invitation. But Adeline didn't need one. She walked in unnoticed, her feet numb beneath her. When she reached the top floor, her breath caught. There they were. Brandon and Miranda. Seated under a canopy of soft lights. Laughing. Sharing wine. Holding hands like they'd never let go. She stood still, her body frozen in place while her heart cracked in real time. Miranda reached across the table, brushing Brandon's cheek with her fingers before leaning in to whisper something that made him laugh, deeply, freely, like he hadn't laughed in months. Adeline knew that laugh. She once lived for it. Now it was an unfamiliar sound coming from a man she no longer recognized. She didn't approach them. She didn't scream or throw a drink. Instead, she turned and walked away, her tears held in by a dam of dignity. When she reached the lobby, she leaned against the marble wall and let herself exhale. The pain was real, sharp like glass, but it was clean. Final. She didn't need an explanation. She didn't need an apology. She had seen enough. Enough to bury what was left of the fantasy and begin mourning the marriage she'd been fighting alone. That night, she didn't go home. She stayed with Emily. And for the first time, she didn't ask herself what she had done wrong. The next morning, Brandon walked into their kitchen humming, expecting coffee and quiet, only to find an empty house. Her wedding ring sat on the kitchen table next to a folded note. It read, "Don't worry. I won't make a scene. I've just had enough of watching myself disappear." He blinked, reading it twice, a cold pit settling in his stomach. He called her phone, no answer. He called Emily, straight to voicemail. Still, he didn't panic. He assumed it was a tantrum. A phase. She'd be back. She always was. But as hours turned into a day, and the day stretched into two, he realized something had shifted. Something irreversible. The silence wasn't laced with hope anymore. It was final. Unapologetic. Adeline hadn't left to hurt him, she left to save herself. And as much as Brandon told himself he was still in control, a small voice whispered the truth he wasn't ready to hear. This time, she wasn't coming back. 3 weeks passed in silence. Adeline hadn't blocked Brandon's number, but she ignored every call, every message, every carefully crafted apology that avoided the real issue. He never said the words she needed to hear, never admitted what he had done, never mentioned Miranda. Instead, he sent vague check-ins like, "Thinking of you," or "Can we talk?" But Adeline was done talking to someone who never listened. She focused on herself, her therapy, her bakery, her slow journey back to her own voice. Then, one morning, a gold-trimmed envelope arrived at the Callahan estate, an invitation to the Prescott Gala, one of Boston's most prestigious high society events, hosted at the historic Ashbourne Manor. The guest list included political figures, billionaires, celebrities, people whose approval could resurrect or ruin a reputation overnight. Brandon was ecstatic. It was his moment to show he was still relevant, still powerful. But to do that, he needed to look flawless. And there was one problem, his wife. When Adeline returned to the house briefly to gather the last of her things, Brandon cornered her in the foyer. "You got the invite, right?" he asked casually, trying to sound light. She nodded. "I'm not going." Brandon hesitated. "Actually, I need you there." She turned, confused. "Why?" That's when he said it, calmly, like it was a reasonable request. "Just don't act like my wife when we're there. Please. Don't cling. Don't call me babe. Don't. Just don't." Her lips parted in disbelief. "You want me there to help your image, but not as your wife?" He gave a half-smile. "It's complicated, Addie. You know how this world is." She stared at him, hollow. "You're ashamed of me." Brandon looked away. I just need to be strategic. It's only one night. That sentence, those words, it's only one night, burned into her. Her eyes didn't well up. She just nodded. Fine. But inside her, something permanent snapped. This wasn't just humiliation. It was annihilation. The night of the gala was a blur of silk gowns, crystal chandeliers, and curated illusions. Adeline arrived alone, dressed in a sleek, emerald gown loaned by Emily, her hair swept up, her presence impossible to ignore. Still, she kept her distance, honoring his request. Brandon floated through the room, shaking hands, laughing too loud, his arm often grazing Miranda's. Adeline stood near the champagne bar, invisible but observant, watching the man who once fought the world for her now pretend she didn't exist. People glanced her way, some out of curiosity, others out of pity. She said nothing, wore a polite smile, and sipped her drink like it was armor. But inside, she was dying. Every laugh Brandon shared with Miranda, every dismissive glance in her direction, carved another wound. She didn't cry. She didn't leave. She endured. And as the music swelled and cameras flashed, she made a silent vow, this will be the last time I ever let someone make me feel small. The morning after the gala, Adeline woke in the guest bedroom of Emily's condo, sunlight bleeding through pale curtains, the night's memories crashing into her like a tidal wave. She sat up slowly, still in the emerald gown, makeup smudged, heels kicked off beside the door where she had stumbled in silent rage. Emily patted in with coffee and didn't ask anything. She just sat beside her, handed her the mug, and said, "Whenever you're ready." But Adeline already knew. She was ready. Ready to stop clinging to a fantasy. Ready to stop defending a marriage built on her sacrifice and his silence. Later that day, she returned to the Callahan estate one last time. Martha, the housekeeper, looked at her with gentle sorrow but said nothing. Adeline went upstairs, packed her belongings into 2 large suitcases, and paused only once, to look at the framed wedding photo on the dresser. She didn't cry. She simply turned it face down. Downstairs, Brandon was on a call, pacing in the sunroom when she entered. He looked up, startled. "Where are you going?" he asked, phone still pressed to his ear. She didn't answer. He hung up quickly. "Adeline, talk to me." She zipped her second bag and turned to him, voice even. "You asked me not to act like your wife. So now I won't be." He blinked, confused. "It was one night. You're overreacting." She stared at him. "You don't get to measure my pain. You don't get to decide what betrayal looks like." He scoffed, frustration rising. "I never cheated." "But you did," she said, quieter now, "with your words, your neglect, your shame." The air between them grew thick with all the things he wanted to say but couldn't. Adeline rolled her suitcase to the door. "I loved you, Brandon. But I love me more now." He called her name once more, but she didn't turn back. That silence? It was her goodbye. Later that evening, her brother Ryan arrived with his truck and helped her load the last of her things. He didn't say much, just hugged her tightly, like he knew how long she'd been holding herself together. She moved into a small apartment in Cambridge above a flower shop owned by an elderly couple who welcomed her with warmth and lavender tea. That first night, surrounded by boxes and uncertainty, Adeline opened her journal and wrote one sentence, "Let this be the season I come back to life." And it was. She restarted therapy with Naomi, found comfort in routine, and began revamping Flower and Light with a fresh vision. She worked in the mornings, read at night, and allowed herself to feel everything: grief, rage, relief. For the first time in years, she slept without waiting for someone to come home. Because home wasn't a person anymore. Home was the peace she had just begun to rediscover within herself. Cambridge mornings were a world away from the polished sterility of the Callahan estate. The hum of delivery vans, the aroma of fresh roses from the flower shop downstairs, and the quiet bustle of pedestrians became the soundtrack to Adeline's new life. She embraced the messiness of beginning again. With Naomi's guidance, she reframed her heartbreak not as failure, but as evolution. Flower and Light had been struggling since her emotional decline, but now, renewed and reinvigorated, she gave it her full focus. She created new menus, launched weekend baking classes, and partnered with a local women's shelter to offer culinary training to single mothers. One of her regulars, a teen girl named Lena, had dropped out of school but found comfort working the counter. Adeline took her under her wing, remembering what it felt like to be unseen. Every croissant baked, every class taught, became her rebellion against the version of herself that once settled for crumbs. During one of the bakery's pop-up events, she was reunited with an old childhood friend, Mason Lynn, who had returned to Boston after founding a tech startup in San Francisco. Mason had always been the brilliant boy with paint-splattered jeans and a mind wired for invention. Now, he was confident, purpose-driven, and surprisingly humble. He admired her courage and saw her potential instantly. "You're sitting on gold, Addie," he told her after sampling one of her famous raspberry tarts. "All you need is reach." Mason offered to help her digitize her brand, build an online platform, offer baking courses virtually, and streamline delivery services. Skeptical at first, Adeline hesitated, but his belief in her was infectious. Together, they designed a rebrand campaign called The Home Within, and within weeks, her following on social media tripled. Her baking tutorials began trending, drawing the attention of local news outlets and food bloggers. For the first time, Adeline wasn't surviving, she was building. One morning, as she was prepping dough for a large catering order, her phone buzzed repeatedly. When she finally checked, her inbox was flooded. A viral food influencer had reposted her croissant-making tutorial with the caption, "The woman who turned heartbreak into honey." Views soared. Orders doubled. Local media wanted interviews. What shocked her most, however, was an email from Horizon Media Group offering her a slot on a televised baking competition series. At first, she laughed aloud in disbelief, but then Mason called her, his voice excited. "This is it, Adeline. This is your Phoenix moment." She stood in the middle of her flour-dusted kitchen, heart-pounding, unsure if she was ready for this new visibility. But then she remembered that night at the gala, the humiliation, the quiet ache of being disregarded, and something in her straightened. She wrote back with trembling fingers, "I accept." Adeline Moore was no longer just healing. She was rising. And this time, she wasn't looking back. The set of Bake to Breakthrough was nothing like Flower and Light's quiet charm. It was steel countertops, bright studio lights, and 12 contestants with knives sharper than their smiles. But Adeline stood among them with her apron tied and her chin high. Viewers quickly fell in love with her humility, her calm presence under pressure, and her ability to transform simple ingredients into magic. The judges nicknamed her the Whispering Wonder because while others dazzled with showmanship, Adeline let the food speak for itself. Week after week, she rose through the ranks, her pain woven into pastries, her growth kneaded into dough. Behind the scenes, Mason helped manage her growing fan base, fielding interview requests and licensing deals. Emily cheered her on like a sister would. Naomi watched proudly. But one person remained silent through it all, Brandon. As Adeline blossomed into a national sweetheart, Brandon's world, once glittering with prestige, began to corrode from within. Back at Nova Bridge, Brandon's once loyal clients began pulling back. Whispers of internal mismanagement circulated, and Chase, his closest ally, quietly jumped ship to a rival firm. Investors questioned his judgment, especially when a former employee leaked screenshots of inappropriate comments he made during Miranda's onboarding. The scandal didn't explode, but it simmered, just enough to taint his brand. Miranda, ever the opportunist, distanced herself publicly, issuing a vague press statement about professional boundaries and mutual respect. The woman Brandon risked his marriage for now treated him like a liability. He reached out to Adeline once, just a short message, "Congrats on the show. You always had it in you." She never replied. He watched her rise from the shadows, interviews, TV segments, brand collaborations, each headline a reminder of the treasure he discarded. His mansion grew emptier, the silence heavier. At night, he scrolled through old photos of them laughing in the kitchen, and for the first time, he realized he hadn't just lost her. He had thrown her away. When Adeline finally won Bake to Breakthrough, the moment was electric. Confetti rained from the ceiling, and her name echoed through every television in the country. Giselle Monroe, a renowned culinary agent, offered her a syndicated cooking show that same night. From Scratch with Adeline Moore premiered just 2 months later, and it shattered every viewership record in its time slot. With Mason managing her tech operations, Naomi helping her craft a mental wellness segment, and Emily handling brand partnerships, Adeline built not just a business, but an empire. She hired women from underserved communities, taught them how to bake, budget, and dream. Her story wasn't just about food. It was about survival and redemption. At her core, Adeline stayed the same, gentle, grounded, grateful. But now, she stood taller. Stronger. No longer a footnote in someone else's narrative. She was the headline. And her story was only just beginning. The divorce papers were delivered to Brandon's penthouse on a gray Thursday afternoon, neatly packed in a cream envelope with no handwritten note, no sentiment, just facts. His assistant handed them to him with a tight-lipped glance before retreating. Brandon stared at the documents for a long time, like they were in a foreign language, then flipped through them with numb fingers. Everything was there: itemized assets, a clean separation of businesses, no request for spousal support. Adeline didn't want a dime. She only wanted her name back. For a man who had controlled every narrative of his life, it was the first time he had no counteroffer, no leverage. And somehow, that was more crushing than any courtroom battle. He poured himself a drink and laughed bitterly, telling himself she was bluffing. But the next morning, when he checked the news and saw her smiling on the Forbes Under 35 Women to Watch cover, reality set in. She had already moved on. As Adeline signed the final page in her attorney's office, a quiet sense of closure settled over her like a freshly folded sheet. It didn't feel like victory, but it didn't feel like grief either. It felt like release. Naomi had warned her that closure isn't loud, it's silent, steady, and sometimes anticlimactic. She understood now. Her life had already evolved so far beyond Brandon that divorcing him felt more like finalizing paperwork on an outdated version of herself. That weekend, she celebrated not with champagne, but by expanding Flower and Light into a second location in Cambridge. Mason surprised her with a minimalist silver necklace engraved with the word whole. Emily cried as she fastened it around Adeline's neck. That night, they toasted with tea and laughter, sharing stories of past heartbreaks and future dreams. There was no talk of men. Just women choosing themselves, celebrating a chapter that had once felt like an ending but now revealed itself as a beginning. Meanwhile, Brandon's spiral accelerated. Clients dropped off one by one, board members turned cold, and rumors spread of financial instability within Nova Bridge. His image was now more cautionary tale than aspirational icon. Worse still, he found himself alone, not just without Adeline, but without Miranda, who had taken a position in Paris and ghosted him entirely. At a networking event, he overheard two investors discussing his downfall. "Should have kept the bakery girl," one said. "At least she had vision." He left early, drank alone that night, and reread old texts from Adeline, the ones where she used to say things like "you're more than the world tells you to be." But now, those messages belonged to a man she no longer recognized. The woman he once underestimated had outgrown him, gracefully, powerfully, permanently. And as Brandon stared at the unsigned divorce papers on his desk, he knew the truth: Adeline hadn't just walked away from the marriage. She had transcended it. The Spring Equinox Gala was the social event of the season, a celebration of innovation and philanthropy hosted by Boston's elite, with camera crews, media outlets, and luxury sponsors filling the grand ballroom of the Astoria Crown Hotel. Brandon hadn't planned to attend, but when his publicist begged him to reclaim his image, he reluctantly agreed. Dressed in a navy bespoke tuxedo, he entered the ballroom with the poise of a man used to commanding attention. But this time, attention barely glanced his way. The air felt different. Conversations hushed not when he entered, but moments later, when Adeline arrived. She floated into the room in a floor-length, pearl-white gown with a plunging back, her natural curls crowned with silver pins, her presence ethereal. She wasn't alone. Lena, her young bakery protégée, walked proudly by her side, representing the culinary mentorship program Adeline had funded. Guests stood. People clapped. Whispers ignited. Adeline Moore had become the headliner Brandon once believed only he could be. He stood frozen near the champagne fountain, watching as photographers clamored for her attention, reporters leaning in for sound bites. When the host introduced her as the honoree of the evening for social entrepreneurship, Brandon felt the weight of irony settle on his shoulders like concrete. He had spent years seeking validation from this exact crowd, and now they orbited around the very woman he once begged to stay invisible. Adeline's speech was brief but powerful. She didn't boast about her show or her success. Instead, she spoke about second chances, resilience, and the importance of building platforms that uplift others. She never mentioned him, not even once. And yet, every word cut deeper than if she had screamed his name. Afterward, when she descended from the stage, the crowd surged forward, donors, city officials, fellow entrepreneurs, all eager to shake her hand. Brandon remained on the outskirts, suddenly aware of how unfamiliar his own city had become without her beside him. He approached her at the end of the night, not sure what he intended to say, apologize, beg, reminisce. But when he finally stood before her, Adeline simply smiled, calm and unreadable. Brandon, she acknowledged, like greeting an old colleague. He cleared his throat. You look incredible. Thank you, she said. Her tone was kind, but distant. He struggled. I saw the show. The mentorship program. You're doing amazing things. She nodded. I am. Silence followed, thick and awkward. Then she added gently, take care of yourself. And just like that, she turned away, called back by someone who actually mattered now. Brandon watched her disappear into a crowd that once ignored her. His chest tightened, not with anger or jealousy, but with regret so deep it felt physical. Karma hadn't struck with thunder. It came wrapped in glitter, applause, and the quiet sound of Adeline's heels walking further and further out of his reach. After the gala, Brandon sat alone in his penthouse apartment, the lights off, city skyline flickering through the tall glass windows. He poured a drink, not because he wanted one, but because silence demanded a companion. As he stared at the untouched whiskey, he thought about the version of himself Adeline once believed in, the man who whispered promises under starlight, who spoke of dreams, of building together. Where had that man gone? The next morning, perhaps out of desperation or a need for clarity, he drove to the Callahan estate for the first time in months. The mansion was unchanged, cold, sterile, full of ghosts. He found his mother, Vivian Callahan, in the solarium, reading. She looked up, unimpressed. Come to lick your wounds? She asked. Brandon didn't react. Instead, he sat across from her and said, tell me the truth. About everything. About why I am the way I am. Vivian raised an eyebrow, closed her book, and smirked. You really want the truth? What followed was not an apology, but a confession wrapped in venom. Vivian revealed how, after Philip Callahan's death, she intentionally shaped Brandon to fear vulnerability. Love makes men weak, she said coldly. And you couldn't afford to be weak. She admitted to manipulating his education, his career, even sabotaging his early college relationship by paying the girl's family to move. She wasn't suitable. Just like Adeline wasn't, she added, with no remorse. Brandon sat in stunned silence, pieces clicking into place, his fear of intimacy, his obsession with control, his inability to handle love that didn't come with conditions. Vivian leaned back, sipping tea. You always thought you were choosing prestige over emotion. Truth is, I taught you that prestige was the only safe choice. The words gutted him. Not because they surprised him, but because he realized he had handed Adeline the same poison he'd been fed his whole life. He hadn't betrayed her because he didn't love her. He betrayed her because he didn't know how to love at all. He left the estate with a hollow ache that no wealth or redemption could fill. That night, he sat at his desk and wrote Adeline a letter he would never send. He wrote everything: how she taught him warmth, how he envied her light, how he destroyed the best thing in his life out of fear. But at the end of the letter, he didn't ask for her back. He only wrote, "I understand now. I let you go because I couldn't let myself be seen." The next day, he signed the divorce papers and mailed them without ceremony. Then he shut down Nova Bridge, sold his shares quietly, and disappeared from the spotlight. For once, Brandon didn't run toward another distraction. He sat in the wreckage of his choices and decided to feel every consequence. Because healing couldn't begin until he stopped pretending he was the victim. And in that dark, quiet space, Brandon Callahan finally began to change, not for her, but for himself. It was a crisp Sunday morning when Adeline first met Julian Knox, though she didn't know then how much that encounter would shift her already transforming life. She was at the Cambridge Farmers Market, shopping for wild berries and raw honey for a seasonal tart. Julian was there with his 8-year-old son, Elliot, who had spilled fresh juice on a display of her branded tote bags. As the vendor grumbled, Julian rushed over with sincere apologies and a warm, disarming smile. "First time in a long time he's been excited to leave the house," he explained, wiping the mess and offering to pay for all the damaged items. Adeline waved him off with a laugh, handing Elliot a fresh tote and a raspberry turnover. Elliot's shy smile mirrored something that stirred in her chest. Julian thanked her again, and as their conversation lingered, she learned he was a widowed community developer, someone who had traded high-rise deals for housing nonprofits after his wife died of leukemia. In the weeks that followed, Adeline found herself running into Julian often, sometimes by coincidence, sometimes not. They talked about everything except romance, grief, resilience, parenting, healing. Julian shared stories of his late wife, Marissa, a schoolteacher who had loved fiercely and left a legacy of kindness in every child she taught. Adeline opened up about Brandon, about love that shrank her, silences that cut deeper than insults, and a marriage she had escaped just before losing herself entirely. Julian never offered pity, only presence. He listened the way Brandon never had, without checking his watch, without waiting for a pause to interject. Their connection wasn't lightning bolts and fireworks. It was soft, slow, and grounded, two people quietly learning that love doesn't have to hurt to be real. Elliot adored Adeline, often dragging his dad by the hand into flower and light just for an excuse to see her. And for the first time in years, she didn't flinch when someone looked at her like she was enough. One evening, after a community event they had both sponsored, Julian walked Adeline home. The night air was cool, her laughter easy. He paused beneath her doorstep and said, "I wasn't looking for anything. Honestly, I thought that part of my life was over. But then you showed up with berry turnovers and a soft kind of fire." Adeline smiled, her heart beating in that unfamiliar yet comforting rhythm of possibility. "I wasn't looking either," she replied. "But I'm not running from it." Julian didn't try to kiss her. Instead, he held her hand for a moment longer than necessary, then said goodnight with the gentleness of a man who understood the value of patience. Inside, Adeline stood by the window watching him walk away, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel haunted by the past. She felt open. Not because of who Julian was, but because of who she had finally become. It came unexpectedly, an email from a national talk show requesting Adeline for a segment titled Women Who Rewrote Their Stories. She hesitated, unsure if she wanted to share the raw parts of her journey on national television. But after some gentle encouragement from Naomi and Mason, she agreed. What she didn't know was that Brandon, now living quietly and working as a consultant in a mid-sized branding firm, had seen the promotional teaser. And in the very depths of his regret, he saw an opportunity, not to reclaim fame, but to reclaim the one piece of his life that still held meaning. Pulling strings through an old network contact, he arranged to be a surprise guest on the show. When the day arrived, Adeline, dressed in soft blue, spoke with warmth and clarity about her journey from betrayal to self-worth. The audience was silent, moved by her vulnerability. Then the host smiled, almost too sweetly, and said, "We have a surprise for you." Brandon walked onto the stage, holding a single white rose, his eyes glistening with uncertainty and desperation. The audience gasped. Adeline's breath caught in her throat, but her face remained composed. He sat beside her, shifting awkwardly as he reached for her hand, which she gently withdrew. "I didn't come to win you back," he began, voice shaking. "I came because the world watched me let go of the best thing in my life, and I needed them to know the truth. I failed. Not just you, but myself. I thought love was something you controlled, not nurtured. And when you started to shine, I shrank from you." The studio was silent. Adeline listened, tears threatening to surface, not because of his words, but because of what she finally realized: she no longer needed them. There was no more hurt to soothe, no longing to repair. Brandon had come to the altar of repentance too late. She had already healed. When the host turned to Adeline and asked if she had anything to say, she leaned forward, calm and resolute. "You didn't lose me at the gala," she said, voice unwavering. "You lost me the moment you asked me not to be myself." The crowd exhaled, the truth sharp but freeing. Brandon nodded slowly, eyes full of sorrow, but he didn't argue. He stood, bowed slightly, and walked off stage with the weight of closure resting heavily on his shoulders. After the show, Adeline stepped outside into the sun where Julian and Elliot were waiting. Elliot ran up and hugged her waist. Julian simply smiled. "You good?" he asked. She nodded. "More than good." As they walked away from the studio, hand in hand, the cameras stayed behind. And so did the shadows of a past she had finally laid to rest, not in bitterness, but in the grace of knowing her value was never up for debate again. The vineyard was quiet that morning, bathed in the soft gold of late spring sunlight. Rows of blooming lavender flanked the garden where white chairs were arranged in neat arcs, and children played beneath rose-covered trellises. This wasn't a wedding born out of spectacle or obligation, it was born out of healing, laughter, friendship, and choice. Adeline stood before a small mirror inside the guest house, her ivory gown simple but elegant, her curls cascading freely over her shoulders. Naomi helped fasten the final button, while Emily stood behind her, dabbing a tear. "You're not just walking down the aisle," Naomi whispered, "you're walking into the life you designed." Outside, Mason handled logistics with a clipboard, and Elliot, dressed in a miniature suit, practiced walking Adeline's puppy down the aisle. The guests weren't elites or politicians. They were community bakers, former students, shelter graduates, and local supporters, each one touched by Adeline's journey. This was her world now. Rooted, radiant, real. Julian waited beneath the archway, his gray suit crisp, his smile calm and unwavering. He wasn't the man who tried to save her, he was the man who stood with her as she saved herself. When Adeline appeared, walking down the aisle not with a man but with Lena and Emily on each arm, a collective hush fell over the crowd. She moved with grace, not to be admired but to be understood. And when she reached Julian, their eyes met, not with the intensity of new lovers, but with the certainty of people who had chosen each other with their eyes wide open. The vows were handwritten, heartfelt, and unapologetically honest. "You don't complete me," Adeline said softly, "because I was never incomplete. But with you, life is fuller, safer, and beautifully shared." Julian's voice trembled as he responded, "You taught me that love doesn't fix what's broken, it holds the pieces steady while you grow. No grandeur, no performance, just truth." After the ceremony, under a canopy of string lights and laughter, guests danced, clinked glasses, and filled the vineyard with joy. Flour and light catered the event, an intentional choice, and the signature almond croissants were served beside sparkling cider. Lena gave a speech that made everyone cry. Elliot insisted on showing Julian and Adeline the painting he had made of their forever house, taped together with glitter and hope. As the evening settled, Adeline stepped aside and looked at the life she'd built, not from perfection, but from every scar, every heartbreak, every risk. She had walked through fire and come out not just standing, but thriving. And somewhere far away, in a quiet city corner, Brandon watched the wedding photo on social media. He smiled faintly, whispered good, and closed his screen. Not in bitterness, but in acceptance. New beginnings weren't always loud. Sometimes, they were quiet gardens, second chances, and a woman choosing herself every single day. The end.